And hello from the campus of Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We welcome you to the Software Engineering Institute's webinar series. Our presentation today is structuring the Chief Information Security Officer organization. Depending on your location, we wish you a good morning, a good afternoon, or good evening. My name is Shane McGraw. I'll be your moderator for the presentation, and I'd like to thank you for attending. We want to make today as interactive as possible, so we will address questions throughout the presentation and again at the end of the presentation. You can submit questions to our event staff at any time by using the Questions tab on your control panel. We will ask a few polling questions throughout the presentation as well. They will appear as a pop-up window on your screen. In fact, the first polling question we'd like to ask is, how did you hear about today's event? Another 3 tabs I'd like to point out are the Files, Twitter, and Surveys tab. The Files tab has the presentation slides there now as a PDF copy, along with other CISO-related work and resources from the SEI. For those of you using Twitter, be sure to follow at SEI News, and you'll want to use the hashtag SEI Webinar. Once again, you want to follow at SEI News, and the hashtag is SEI Webinar. And lastly, the survey we ask that you fill out upon exiting the event, as your feedback is always greatly appreciated. And now I'd like to introduce our presenters for today. Julia Allen will be joining us from California. And Julia is a principal researcher within the Software Engineering Institute's CERT division. She has been with the SEI since 1992. She serves as Deputy Director and Chief Operating Officer for 3 years, as well as Acting Director for an interim period of 6 months. She has been with the CERT division since 1997. She's the author of the CERT Guide to System and Network Security Practices and moderator of the CERT podcast series, Security for Business Leaders. Dr. Nader Mahaveri is a principal member of the technical staff within the CERT division of the SEI. And his current areas of interest and research include operational resilience, cybersecurity and resilience management, protection and sustainment of critical infrastructure, preparedness planning, and associated risk management principles and practices. Dr. Mahaveri has over 33 years of experience in leading and performing technical, business, research, and teaching activities in aerospace, defense, telecommunications, transportation, and consulting industries for domestic and international entities, as well as academic environments. And now I'd like to turn the presentation over to Julia Allen. Julia, once again, joining us from California. Julia, all yours. Go ahead.
Oh, Shane, great. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We're very excited about this body of work. It's something that we've been working on for some time, and we're hoping that you'll find it useful as well. So the topics for today are listed here. I'm going to walk you through, Nader and I together are going to walk you through the process that we actually used for determining this candidate structure that we're going to discuss with you. Its foundation is 4 key functions that a CISO performs. I'll also talk about the sources that we use to flush those out into the next level of sub-functions and activities. We'll present a candidate organizational structure. And of course, we would be remiss if we didn't give you some ideas for how to take this work and apply it to your own organization. I'm hoping that most of you are familiar with the Software Engineering Institute and hopefully with CERT by virtue of your being with us today. We are a federally funded research and development center. We've been in business for some time with our mission to improve the state of the practice and the state of the art in software engineering. For CERT, cybersecurity is the name of the game, all aspects, full life cycle, all the way from policy and governance through to detailed technical practices, controls, and forensics investigations. The team that Nader and I are on is called the Cyber Risk and Resilience Management Team. As indicated by Shane's kind introductions, we do work in applied research all the way through to application with our federal, state, and commercial partners, both U.S. and international. specifically in the areas embodied in our CERT resilience management model, resilience management, operational risk management. And I think one of the unique perspectives we have, as amply demonstrated by Nader's background, is the integration of cybersecurity and those other disciplines that can disrupt an organization's mission. So I'm going to start with a process diagram and then a text slide to give you an idea of this structure and how we went through developing it. We've worked for many years, CERT, since 1988. We've been in business engaging with chief information security officers and security professionals around the globe. You may be aware that we're very heavily engaged in high-impact cybersecurity incident analysis and forensics investigation, particularly on behalf of some of our government customers. So we have a very pragmatic, tactical experience dealing with ongoing and aftermath of big incidents. And I think we all recognize the expanding risk environment. Nader will talk about this at some length about it's really shifted what a CISO needs to concern themselves with. It's no longer sufficient to think about the traditional protection aspects of information security, but you really need to extend your thinking to not if it'll happen, but when it'll happen and how you respond, recover, and return to normal operations. So all of these factors and the years of experience that CERT has had influenced our inputs and observations to identify 4 key CISO functions that Nader will be breaking down for you that serves as a foundation for this organizational structure we'll be discussing. So at this point, Nader, over to you.
Thanks, Julia, for getting us started. As Julia mentioned, the first thing we're going to discuss today is these 4 key functions that we believe are foundational for today's chief information security organizations. As I'm sure you're all aware, traditionally information security teams have been tasked to protect and shield organizational information assets from cyber risk and cyber attacks. We also know that such strategies are no longer sufficient. We read about cyber intrusions on a daily basis. We hear about them, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are some of you in the audience who have actually experienced it in your organization. There are small ones, there are large ones, there are ones that we know about, the ones that maybe are not apparent to our organizations. The message here is that all of those traditional schemes and strategies and tools and technology to protect one's organization from cyber attacks are absolutely necessary. They are no longer sufficient because they often fail from time to time. And when they fail, sometimes we don't know about it. Sometimes it takes weeks or months for us to identify them. Sometimes we're told by somebody outside of our organization that such things are happening in our enterprise. And there are good industry data about such statistics. And therefore, a second very critical function for organizational to consider as part of their information security team is to build and enhance their capability to monitor and detect these type of abnormal activities in their organizations. We want them to become hunters for adversaries who might have penetrated the system or environment, and look for them very explicitly. So that's a secondary necessary function to be put in place. We don't think that's sufficient either, because adversaries are very clever, they're very good about hiding themselves, and and sometimes it takes some time to identify them while they're doing their mishaps. Now, we frequently hear about consequences of cyber attacks. They are often disclosure of privately identifiable information. They reveal some corporate messages. Maybe they cause some loss of credit card information. They all primarily interception of information or fabrication or modification. These are things that we hear about all the time. Recently, however, adversaries are becoming interested in other things. They are becoming interested in interrupting or destroying data, shutting down day-to-day operations, making physical damage to the infrastructure, and deleting or destroying data. Once we realize that, and examples of those incidents we hear and read about from time to time, the recent Sony Picture cyber incidents is a good example of it. In addition to all the consequences of that cyber incident, the business operations at Sony was affected because the cyber intrusion caused damage to the IT infrastructure. And therefore, a very critical third function for the information security teams to be fully involved with is to respond, recover, and sustain operations once bad things happen. Incident response type activities, being involved in business continuity, being involved with disaster recovery, having coordinated efforts to respond and recover from cyber intrusion effects. Those three, although critical, they won't be as effective if they're not supported by a comprehensive set of integrated management, governance, maybe a bit of compliance, education, and risk management activities. We can throw all the tools and technology at the problem. If we don't worry about the items listed on the bottom of this structure, if we don't worry about people and processes, the other functions will not work as well. So this is the four key functions that we now believe are the key components of any information security team under a Chief Information Security Officer. So at this time, I'm going to bring up one of the polling questions.
Okay, so as we mentioned at the beginning, we'll launch a few polling questions throughout the presentation to help us direct the flow of the talk to make sure you're getting all you need out of this presentation. And that question is on your screen now, asking, do these four functions cover your current or planned CISO responsibilities? So we'll give you about 15 seconds to vote for that. And while we're doing that, Nader, we'll answer a question from the queue from Joseph asking, I think this is from the last slide. It seems like the top three functions have more of a technical, technology, and engineering nature, and the bottom one is more like a set of critical, non-technical activities. Is there a place I can go to learn more to do the activities in the bottom box well? Now let me know if you need a repeat there. But looking for where to do the activities in the bottom box well.
I think that's a relatively accurate characterization of those four boxes. Julia, when she started our discussion, she referred to a particular body of knowledge, CERT resilience management model, that our team has been fortunate in having the opportunity to develop, maintain, and help organizations to put into place. That body of work is, in fact, a very good place for organizations and individuals to go to if they want to learn about a comprehensive, integrated way to deal with those people and process issues that concentrated in that fourth box in our solution.
Another quick one we'll squeeze in from Duncan asking, do those three functions have to sit in the CISO organization, or could they be distributed throughout?
Excellent question. Actually, the audience will hear a little bit more about this as we talk about additional details of the CISO structure. The idea is that no, not all of those functions or capabilities or activities needs to report directly to a chief information security officer. There are organizational structure present in our environment, in our organizations, that's hard to change, and therefore our study has taken that into consideration, allowing for certain functions to be quote-unquote subcontracted to other entities within the organization, or even being outsourced to external entities.
Okay, and I'm going to just go over the polling results real quick. So the question was, do these 4 functions cover your current or planned CISO responsibilities? And our results were 61% yes, 37% partially, 2% no. So if you're in that partial or no category, feel free to chime into the question box with some other responsibilities you have, and we'll pick Nader's and Julia's brain on those topics as well. So feel free to type those in. So Nader, back to you.
So I'm going to pass it on to Julia to continue our conversation.
Thank you, Nader and Shane. Much appreciated. So as promised, we're going to keep building out this process for determining the organizational structure. You've heard us talk about what fed our conclusions to create the 4 key CISO functions that Nader described. And now what I'm going to talk with you about is what we did next to really flesh these out and put some meat on the bones, considering a series of sources, which I'll describe in the next slide, and then breaking these down, doing affinity grouping, and mapping them into the next level of detail that would eventually result in a CISO organizational structure. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. Here are the sources we considered. Hopefully many of these are near and dear to some of your day-to-day efforts. We looked at a range of typical information security policies for large, diverse organizations, both geographically and mission and production diverse. In the U.S., there's a whole series of publications from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, specifically 800-53, which is a catalog of security and privacy controls. Some of you may be familiar with NIST's work, the cybersecurity framework that they have developed and have been promoting for use. The next one, bullet number 4, you may not be that interested in. This deals with the workforce, the education, the training, the knowledge, skills, and abilities of the workforce, and how you put them into a framework, because as we know, this is all done by people. We took into account the current version of the SANS Top 20. We've talked about the CERT Resilience Management Model, and several organizations, including the U.S. Department of Energy, have derived capability maturity model, process models from CERT RMM, and most notably the Department of Energy. Their model was a basis for this effort, and many industry-wide research reports on current practice. Noticeable by its omission, perhaps, is the whole ISO 27000 series, and while we did not specifically map to it, we did confirm that all of its requirements were covered by the combination of these sources. So these were all taken into account. And then what we did is we took all of these, we affinity grouped them, we broke them down into their next level of function, sub-function, and department, and Nader's going to take you through some of those gory details. Over to you, Nader.
So just to give you an idea of the level of details that we went through, and some of this level of details is actually available to you if you download our technical report. We started by those 4 functions that I talked about. Those affinity grouping that Julia talked about, we categorize all of those key functions from all of those sources into 4 groups, and we started taking layers of onion off. We asked the question, okay, what should be done in certain departments, what should be done in certain sub-functions within each department, and as I mentioned a few minutes ago in response to the question we had, we actually did consider which of these tasks or functions or departments could potentially be done by another entity within the organization outside of the CISO organization. That information is available. And then we double-checked our work by making sure all of those good, well-practiced items that we had mined from those sources that Julia talked about are mapped and nothing had been missed. So this is the level of detail that's available that eventually led us to draw a hypothetical org structure that one may see in their enterprise as the structure of their Chief Information Security Officer. So we do have a sample of such a structure, and I'm going to let Julia to walk you through it.
Okay, at this point, Shane, did we want to see if we had any questions from our listeners?
Let me pull it up here 1 sec. Okay, yeah, one from Amanda asking, are there other sources that one should consider when tailoring the methodology discussed in this webinar? So I guess you listed some resources on an earlier slide. Do you have other sources that can be tailored at this point, or that we can discuss at this point?
So
point people to.
So some of those sources that Julia talked to are type of sources that could apply to almost any organization operating in any industry in any part of the world. Clearly, when organizations want to apply some of these work that we have done to their own specific environment, there are other sources to consider. Clearly, some organizations, depending on the industry they're in, have to worry about rules and regulations that's put upon them based on the industry. If they operate in 50 different countries, they may have to worry about additional rules and regulations that they have to worry about. So that list of sources that we have provided, when they try to adapt it to their environment, they need to consider, okay, what other sources that I need to consider based on who I am, who I work for, what industry I'm in, which part of the world I operate, etc.
Okay. And before we turn it back over to Julia, just a reminder to everyone or anybody joining us late, there is a download files tab on your console that you can walk away with a PDF copy of the slides from today's presentation, along with the technical report on the CISO organization, along with other work from SEI and CERT in this space. So, Julia, we'll kick it back to you.
Okay, Shane, thank you, and Nader, thank you very much. So I was remiss in not mentioning the technical report at the top of my remarks, but all the details of everything we're discussing today, the mappings that Nader referred to, and a detailed description of this candidate organizational structure that I'm about to walk through for you are all described in the technical report. And for those of you that have downloaded the PDF of that report, I encourage you, I'm going to put up the candidate organizational structure. If you want to keep this in front of you while I'm describing each of these units, it might help serve as a navigational aid. But given the analysis that Nader described that we did from the foundational four functions to sub-functions, activities, departments, affinity grouping, looking at what could be insourced and outsourced, et cetera. This is the structure that we developed. And we'll talk about this a little bit at the end, but perhaps the way to listen to this is to think about how these various activities are done in your organization today and use this as if you will, kind of a framework and saying, okay, do we do that? Don't we do that? Is that something that's working particularly well? Is that something that I need to shore up? Or maybe I'm missing a function or a department altogether. So use this as, if you will, a template or something that you can compare your current organizational activities to and with. So I'm going to take you through each of these briefly. I'm going to go from right to left, starting with program management. Okay, so this is a pretty typical function in just about any organization, be it security or other related activity. You've got planning, you've got programming of the plan, roles and responsibilities, making sure you've got adequate resources, dealing with funding, doing all the tracking that happens when you're making a significant investment in an organization, in this case for information security. I'd like to particularly point out to you the last bullet, identify, review, and assess and enable business functions, because clearly cybersecurity and the CISO role is a supporting function that is here to make sure that the business continues to operate as intended. And so a key part of the CISO's role in the program management office and then the manager that's responsible for that is to make sure that all business functions are enabled as needed by the security activity. Again, following along on the org chart, the next department, Governance, Risk, and Compliance, sometimes referred to as GRC, not to be confused with GRC tools. We do recommend the use of tools, but you need to know what you're doing first before you embark on any kind of a tool acquisition and implementation. But this is where the program and plan is done at the policy level, setting strategic guidance for the organization and making sure that guidance is followed, making sure you've got a reasonable risk management framework and process in place for identifying, tracking, and mitigating risk. And then all of the oversight. I'll talk specifically about significant oversight function, the Information Security Executive Council in a bit, but just making sure that change control boards, other oversight boards, are done on a compliance perspective, making sure controls are adequate and interfacing with the audit function of the organization. And last but not least, personnel and external relationships, managing your vendor, supplier, and contractor interfaces, your business partner interfaces, keeping in touch with major external stakeholders, regulatory bodies, and others who you depend on. For example, when a major incident occurs, in the U.S., the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and making sure your press relationships are well established, and then dealing with all the people aspects that come with an effective cybersecurity program, knowledge, skills, and abilities, training and awareness, acceptable use. So all of those things live within the program management department and its units in this candidate organizational structure. So I'm going to move next to more of the operational aspect of the organization. So the Security Operations Center, I suspect many of you have these. They're responsible for all of the day-to-day security operations activities. And this is a case where much of this is performed by the IT organization with oversight from the CISO. As some of you know, I'm sure the relationship between the CISO and IT director can be contentious at times, because they're trying to achieve different objectives, but they must really work effectively together to establish situational awareness, intelligence collection. This is where the monitor, detect, and hunt function is done in large part going back to Notter's 4 functions, managing all the malicious code that crosses your desk. And this is also the first line of defense for cybersecurity incidents, sometimes called a computer incident response team or computer security incident response team. And these folks interact with another major department very actively, the Emergency Operations and Incident Management Department. And these are the folks that mobilize when something big happens. So they exist as an entity. I'll talk in a moment about the things they do during normal operations, but when something big happens, the Emergency Operations and Incident Management team or department interacts very heavily with the Security Operations Center to make sure that all the feet are in the ground, people are in the roles they need to be in, things are happening, communication channels are established, not taking place across the assets and hosts and systems that are compromised. And but on the times when they can take a breath and they aren't busy fighting fires, they do planning in incident management, business continuity, and disaster recovery. They run test exercises and drills to make sure that the organization is prepared when something happens. And I would say probably one of the biggest gap areas that we see in many of the organizations that we work with is in the area of problem management, root cause analysis, and after-action reports. Typically, when the dust settles after something big, the organization often doesn't have the collective will to dig in and find out how did we get ourselves in this mess. And that's really housed in this particular sub-function where you really dig down, find out what processes worked and didn't work, develop after-action reports, communicate to all the key players, and, of course, investigation is a key part of this capability. Let me just pause here for a moment. Shane, any questions at this point before I describe the last major department?
We do have a couple questions here. One from Duncan asking, where would security architecture sit? Would it sit with other architecture practices or in the CISO organization?
Perfect question. It's my next slide. If I may hold that question until I advance one.
Sure.
Anything else?
Yeah, we have another one from Carl asking, managing third parties, for example, cloud providers and supplier connectivity to ensure risk to business data is managed appropriately is a significant challenge. Can you provide more insight into how to address this organizationally?
Right. So bear with me while I go back a bit. 2 slides ago, personal and external relationships. We have a home for that function, and it's called external relationship management. In the CERT resilience management model, we call it external dependencies, managing external dependencies. So this is where that function is performed. In terms of the actual doing, I would refer you to that portion of the CERT resilience management model, and it will give you detailed goals and practices for managing those relationships with critical third parties.
Great. We have a couple others, but we'll let you move on, Julie, unless you want to get back to the one with the architecture practices, and then we can move on.
Okay, so let's talk about architecture. So if you've got your org chart in front of you, on the far left, you'll see this department called Security Engineering and Asset Security. And I'm going to talk about the six roles that department fulfills, including security architecture. So typically we don't always see these functions combined. So this is, again, security engineering and asset security. So what this encompasses is the full life cycle of your critical assets. Everything from the time you develop security requirements to acquire or build something, all the way through to putting a key system, a host, a network, an information asset, a database, into its actual operational environment. And I really wanted to point out, and this is one of the areas I think that's rather unique about this structure. If any of you are following the DevOps movement, which is about creating a more integrated and more seamless relationship between development and IT operations, we've encompassed that into this function in our proposed organization structure, because if you don't have IT folks working during development, if you don't have development folks having to follow their product into operations, I think we're all very familiar with the kind of problems that causes. So with respect to the question you asked earlier, Shane, we put security architecture here, specifying your security requirements, whether you're building, acquiring, mashing up, whatever it is that you're doing, the security architecture, making sure that all aspects of those requirements are reflected into the top level and detailed design and the component architecture and the interfaces of that particular system or operational environment, making sure that those requirements and that architecture are propagated throughout the entire development and acquisition lifecycle, and certainly last but not least, making sure that all the boxes have been checked and all the work has been done before you release the system into production. So this is where we address architecture, and yes, we do consider that to be a CISO function, but going back to something Nader said earlier, it could be outsourced to a development shop within the organization, but the CISO has very definite, in our proposed structure, very definite oversight responsibility. So this is one of the 6 units within the Security Engineering and Asset Security department, and I'll talk about the other 5 now. So identity and access management, this is pretty familiar, I'm sure, to most of you that are involved in this aspect. Managing the identities, the access controls that implement those identities, and all the various technologies that allow you to assert and confirm that your people, your systems, anything that's requesting access, other objects are legitimate and authorized. So that's where this was. The third of 6, application security. This deals with the application's assets, software, anything that you acquire, inventories, access controls, managing those configurations, patching, keeping everything up to date, making sure that your critical applications are protected as best they can be, and managing changes to those. You'll see a little bit of replication or duplication of these functions applied to a different type of asset, your hosts and your network, making sure that you've got the critical ones inventoried, you know who's connected, you're controlling access, and again, configuration management and change management in terms of your standard configurations and any changes, and network controls, everything to do with your perimeter, both your intranet, your internet, everything that has to do, this is where you actually implement a lot of the security architecture that was set as requirements early in the life cycle. Information asset security, you might also think of this as data management, where you categorize the sensitivity of your information and vital assets, make sure your critical assets are inventory, that you've got an owner assigned. I should have said that earlier. For any asset that's inventoried, clear designation of ownership and custodianship, who owns it and who's responsible for taking care of it, and your information asset controls in accordance with requirements. We do have a placeholder for physical access control. Typically, all of the physical security, facility security, is typically managed outside of the CISO's organization, sometimes by a chief security officer or a facilities manager. But there's a very critical interface between those two roles here in terms of electronic access to facilities, badge readers, other types of biometrics, other types of ways of controlling access to facilities and hosts and networks, and making sure those access controls are enforced. If this is a relatively small operation for a CISO, this could be combined with the identity and access management function if you wanted to get those down to a little bit smaller subset. And before I move on, I wanted to repeat here, the reason that we put these together, the early life cycle activities, requirements, architecture, with the operational activities, is to encourage, through the organization structure, a much tighter coupling between development and operations. And then one of my closing charts in this section is to bump up to the dotted line box that reports in or connects to the Chief Information Security Officer, which is the Information Security Executive Council. These folks are the advisors to the CISO. They bring in, as you can see, by sample membership, the other key leadership roles in the organization that need to care about and probably have requirements for cybersecurity. This council is one of the ways to enact governance as managed by the Chief Information Security Officer, and as you can see, it includes legal concerns, financial concerns, obviously HR, because this is a big people issue. But you also want to have the business unit leadership VPs, the engineering VP, and certainly whoever is responsible for managing information technology. At this point, Shane, I think we might have another polling question, and we can also take some questions.
And we do have a question, and that the third and final polling question for today is asking, does this candidate organizational structure cover your current or planned CISO responsibilities? So if something you're facing has not been covered, feel free to type that into the Q&A box, and we can add that to the list of topics. But let's get some questions while people are voting. So lots of questions in the queue. So we're going to go one from Murray here asking, would you say that the 4 boxes described correspond to the 4 CISO functions? Would you say that the 4 boxes described correspond to the 4 CISO functions?
I have to say yes, because the 4 functions that I described at the very beginning are the underlying structure of the org chart, the candidate org chart that Julia just walked us through.
Okay. Julia, anything to add?
Yeah, I would say that it may not be kind of an automatic one-for-one, Shane, but clearly program management is the foundational management and governance function that Nader described. Emergency operations goes with respond and recover. The security operations center certainly goes with the monitor, hunt, detect. And there are clearly a number of aspects of the protection side of the equation that are in the security engineering and asset security suite of units and activities. So I think I would agree with Nader that they do align, but I think it would be too simplistic to say that they're one for one, because you'll see as you dive into the details, you will find activities in each of these departments that could span 2, 3, or 4 of the functions.
Okay. And we'll get in one more question here from Leslie asking, are you recommending that the CISO function exist as an independent organization rather than being part of another department such as the IT organization? What position should the CISO report into?
So we get that question very often. One of the most often questions that we get is, where should an organization place their information security organization or function, or who should the Chief Information Security Officer report to? Our examination of many organizations and having looked at incidents and how organizations respond to, we have to say there is no silver bullet. There is no right answer that matches every organization's needs and businesses. So clearly, many organizations have Chief Information Security Officers reporting to their IT organization. For many organizations, that works. We have seen Chief Information Security Officers reporting to the organization's Chief Risk Officer, because information security is a major operational risk management activity. So our recommendation for organizations to decide where to house their information security function is, let's look at your overall enterprise business objectives, how things are done today, where the functions that Julia just talked about are performed today, and then ask the question, does it make sense to move people around or move departments around or put the CISO under a different structure?
Great. Okay, before we turn it back to Nader, we'll give you the survey results real quick. So the question was, does this candidate organizational structure cover your current or planned CISO responsibilities? We had 54% with yes, 38% with partially, and 8% with no. So again, if you're in that partial or no area, feel free to type in some information into the Q&A box. Nader, we'll turn it back to you.
And let me add one more piece of information to answer to the previous question.
Sure.
Regardless of where you end up putting the information security organization, or regardless of who Chief Information Security reports to, maybe a more important thing to make sure is that information security activities have a very high executive sponsorship. And that executive sponsorship makes the information security function to be elevated at the enterprise level, so it gets the focus that it needs, regardless of where the activities are actually performed. That's probably even more important than where to put the functions.
Right.
All right. Let us finish our conversation today by just recommending a few potential next steps that you who have been sitting through our conversation today could take. One thing you could do is you could look at your existing Chief Information Security Officer organization, how it's structured, and see if it maps to the candidate structure that we have talked about. Ask the question, hey, does it map well? If it doesn't map well, are there things that are missing, or are there things that should be enhanced? So those are some of the maybe next steps that if you want to take right away before too long, that probably makes sense. And then if you identify areas that needs to be changed or enhanced or moved, use some of those sources that Julia talked about that will provide you guidance as to how to implement some of these activities. And don't forget to take baby steps. You don't want to take too big of a bite of an apple to begin with. We have provided you some additional resources. As I mentioned, a copy of the technical note that has the details of our study is available. The copy of the slides are available. In the next slide, we have listed several references that might be of some interest. Probably in late December, early January, we'll post a podcast based on this subject. So if you want to hear more about the subject, you can take advantage of that podcast. And then as you go down the road and you want to get additional wider training about Chief Information Security Officer activities, you can consider such programs as Carnegie Mellon University's Chief Information Security Officer Executive Training Program that is available. So that's the list of references that I was referring to that's in the back of the slides. And Shane, I think we're going to stop here and see if there are any more questions or any other conversations we want to have.
Great. We got lots of great questions in the queue. And just a reminder, everybody, before exiting today's webinar, to please fill out that survey, as your feedback is greatly appreciated. All right, let's get to another question from Murray asking, can you talk a bit about having security architecture within the CISO span of control and the need of security architecture to also relate to a chief architect in an enterprise architecture function? Please let me know if you need a repeat.
I'm going to actually let Julia answer that question since she just finished talking about some of that concept a few minutes ago.
That is actually a great question, which I appreciate. So that's really a lot of that's going to depend on the people involved, the kind of leadership model that's in the organization, if it's strictly hierarchical or if there's more peer-to-peer, more collaboration between units. But I would recommend that if security architecture is a significant activity within the organization, that the chief architect, together with the chief security architect, both sit on the Information Security Executive Council, that there be very active collaboration, because clearly the architect for the entire enterprise is going to have many concerns beyond just security, but security needs to be first and foremost in their thinking. And through some mechanism like the Information Security Executive Council or some sub-unit of that council, I think that you'll be able to get the kind of collaboration and integration of those two perspectives. But I would still keep security architecture, if not a direct report activity to the CISO, certainly an area where the CISO has some legitimate, recognized oversight responsibility. This goes back to my comments earlier about working hard to integrate earlier life cycle activities in a system or software development project with the operational responsibility for keeping that system or product secure once it goes into its operational setting.
Okay, great. We'll move on to the next question from Tanisha asking, how will you structure the CISO with an already established configuration management and change management? How would you structure the CISO with an already established configuration management and change management, I guess, structure? Is that?
Yeah. So as Julia was walking you through the candidate structure, there was one department where configuration management and change management was listed explicitly to be part of that function. So most organizations already have change and configuration management activities. If you are happy with the performance of those existing change management and configuration management, and whatever happy means to your enterprise, then you could leave them where they are as you consider how to change the rest of your organization. If you think you're not happy with how change management and configuration management are done today, that is, you're not happy with how they perform or support the rest of the activities, then you want to go through that exercise that I mentioned. Okay, compare what you have today with the sample structure that we have provided you to see if you go to the sample structure, where does configuration change management fall into, and then ask the question, if I move them there, would it solve my problem?
Nader, can I interject as well?
Of course.
So going back to our proposed organizational structure, you may recall that we took what we call an asset-centric view in establishing these units. So you have a unit for application security, one for host and network security, and one for information asset security. And if you look back on those slides or in the technical report, you'll see that each of them has a change and configuration management aspect to it. And to go back to the original question, when you said that there's an existing approach, does it cover all of those assets? Does it cover configuration and change management for your software and other applications, for your host and networks? And the one that tends to typically be missing is information asset security. In other words, do you have really conscientious change and configuration management around your big information assets, your big repositories, your inventories, your various databases? And are those really handled all by the same teams? Likely not. But regardless of how they're done, as Nader said, if they're done well, adding the CISO oversight or interaction to those existing functions may suffice, or you may need to do some re-architecting and some re-engineering.
Okay. Next, we got one from Borja asking, who would be in charge of the security life cycle of applications that are created in the cloud? Who would need to participate in this life cycle in the security organization? Can you explain the roles participating in this life cycle and their tasks?
Julia, you want to take that one?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Okay, in the structure that we've proposed, it would be a combination of the security engineering function, so it still lives under the CISO, someone who's responsible for carrying the security requirements all the way through architecture design, prior to release into production. But when you're dealing with a cloud service provider, that is an external relationship. And you may recall that the management of external relationships, at least we have it, in our candidate structure allocated to the program management function. But again, still under the CISO. So you would need to take whoever is responsible for the relationship with that cloud service provider and marry them up in some type of team with your security engineering staff, and make sure that there are mechanisms in place, either through a service level agreement. I mean, sometimes these big cloud service providers, you basically get what they give you. You don't have a lot of ammunition unless you're a big customer of theirs. But through service level agreements, through whatever their terms or conditions, whatever recourse you have for monitoring, whatever happens when a big incident takes place, on the CISO side, the responsibilities would be those responsible for managing that cloud service provider relationship together with those in security engineering who ensure that the requirements, the security requirements that you as a customer of that service provider have are actually being fulfilled through whatever mechanisms you have with them to monitor, to oversee, and ultimately to pay them for providing the service that you've contracted for. So you'd have to actually take advantage of several of the capabilities within the CISO structure. Hopefully I answered your question at least partially.
Sounded good to me. All right, next we got, are there any planned updates to the CERT Resilient Management Model? The book is excellent, but it was published in 2010, and I imagine that Julia Allen and others have new insights and developments to share. And that was not submitted by Julia Allen herself. So that was submitted by Mark. So, Julia, if you want to chime in there.
Well, actually, this one, I think it's funny as it sounds, even though I'm listed as one of the authors. Nader's been more intimately involved with the team that is actually looking at version 1.2 and version 2.0. So if you'd like to summarize that, Nader.
So since the model was formally published in 2011 in the book format, in addition for our team helping organizations to put it into process, we have actually developed what we call derivatives of the model. We have developed derivatives for certain communities. We have developed derivatives for certain domains of interest. Every time we develop one of those derivatives, we have actually updated certain aspects of the model. For example, Julia referred to the work that was sponsored by the Department of Energy that resulted in the creation of what is referred to as the Cybersecurity Capability Maturity Model. When we developed that derivative of RMM, we introduced new domains and process areas that is not explicitly present in the book. So the body of knowledge has continuously been evolved. And some of those evolvements are documented into these derivatives that we have developed. We have developed an expanded version of the model for U.S. Postal Service, where we have actually made the model bigger. So the model has been changing, and there are documentations available to show how the model has been derived for other purposes or had made bigger for certain other environments. Although we can't point you to version 1.2 of the book, because these days maybe a typical textbook might not be the best way to keep up with all the changes that are taking place.
Okay, terrific. Murray would sorry. Go ahead, Julia. Yep.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I should say, though, we do have plans in the very near future to start releasing updated process areas that we're calling version 1.2. So it's an incremental update to the 26 process areas in CERT RMM, and we do have plans in 2016 to begin looking at significant maybe even architectural changes to the model that would eventually be reflected in version 2.0, but I'm not prepared to commit any dates on that. But we're looking at both an incremental upgrade and a major version upgrade.
Terrific, thank you. Okay, Murray would like to know, can you talk a bit about the relationship between the CISO regarding information management function and larger business intelligence initiatives in organizations where information management represents but one component of the overall business intelligence undertaking?
So we have worked with, as Julie mentioned at the beginning, we spend quite a bit of time helping other organizations to put into practice some of the things that we work on, including some of the things that we talked about today. We have worked with organizations that data and information is part of the day-to-day operations, day-to-day business function. For those organizations, Chief Information Security Officer and Chief Information Security Organizations becomes an enabler for those part of the organizations whose job is to collect, manipulate, deliver that information to the rest of organizations to enable day-to-day business operations. So making the CISO a key partner with those part of organizations becomes critical.
Okay, terrific. We got about a minute left, so we'll just get to dive into another one real quick. From Carl asking, can you ballpark the relative size of the four organization structures compared to each other?
Julia, do you want to take the last question?
Sure. Sure. We really haven't done any kind of detailed analysis on size by the four major departments, but we do have in the technical report some really, I think, excellent rules of thumb for sizing the overall Chief Information Security Officer organization, and from those you may be able to derive some kind of units of measure for each of the four major departments. But I would point you to the technical report for some additional guidance on sizing and resourcing this organizational structure.
Okay, I know we're two-thirds. We're going to try to squeeze in one more question here real quick from Patrick asking, we are at the advent of cloud computing, and much of it is already in use commercially today, as opposed to traditional secure servers. What new or special security developments are needed before the general public can be assured that cloud computing is safe from cyber hackers?
So I'm going to go back to something that Julia mentioned a few minutes ago in response to the previous question that we had about cloud services. In the same way that organizations are dependent on external services for many things, anywhere from power and internet service providers, cloud services could be looked upon as yet another very critical external services that is required for day-to-day business activities to operate. In the same way that information security teams worry about how to deal with issues related to their internet service provider, they can also start worrying about at the same level of how they should worry about their cloud service provider. That includes not only availability, but issues of, okay, how does the cloud service provider satisfy my requirement for confidentiality, integrity, availability? What confidence can they give me that they are meeting those requirements for my stakeholders?
Terrific.
Right, and what actions will they take in the event of a major data breach? How will I be protected? How will I be notified? How will I be involved?
Terrific. Nader, Julia, thank you very much for your excellent presentation. Folks, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks again for your participation, and we look hosting you at the next webinar. Have a great day.